Dr. Sean is an associate professor of mathematics education in the School of Teacher Education, and he is also associate director of the Florida Center for Research in Science, Technology, Engineering, and Mathematics at the Learning System Institute at Florida State University. His research interests include student cognition in mathematics and statistics, the mathematical and statistical education of teachers, educational and psychological measurement, and the evaluation of educational interventions. Dr. Sean received the Mathematics Educator of the Year Award from Florida Association of Mathematics Teachers Educators in 2019 and from the Florida Council of Teachers of Mathematics in 2022. He has pre-registered several studies using Open Science Framework and the Registry for Educational Effectiveness Studies. He shares data and replication code through Open Science Framework and the University Consortium for Policy and Social Research. It's my pleasure to invite Dr. Sean to deliver his speech.
Thank you. Thank you, and thank you all for being here. So I guess first I want to say, before I get into this, as you might guess from that bio, I don't do research in open science. I try to become a practitioner of open science, but my research area is in math and statistics education. And so I believe I'm preaching to the choir here, so I think I'll go through a lot of this just really quickly, and basically this is kind of why I'm interested and attracted to open science. That's what I'm going to talk about. So this is more just a rhetorical question. I don't know an empirically based answer other than my own experience, but what's the average number of times an author or a group of authors submits a manuscript to a journal for consideration for publication and into the peer review process? And not necessarily how many times do they revise and resubmit, but how many different journals do they end up having to submit to? I don't know the answer to the question, but in my experience, it probably averages at least 3 or 4. And I think this may be different for, maybe I'm not a particularly good writer, but I think one of the reasons this happens with my research is I do randomized controlled trials, and that's not typical in my field. And there's a lot of skepticism and sort of fear of that, mostly skepticism in my field that I'm somehow collapsing this complex, really important, complex, multifaceted issue into some sort of single dimension, right? And so there's a general sense from reviewers who also don't have a lot of knowledge of the methodology and the statistics. So they'll often tell me that blocking is a term that you use in the design of randomized trials sometimes, where you can sort of, in my case, maybe we'll block on school districts. If we have 9 school districts, there's something that each of them have in common with the schools within that district have something in common with each other that the others don't. So maybe we'll say we're going to randomize our schools within districts. So if we have 9 school districts, we'll say that district is a block, right? And we want to have roughly equal number of schools within each district in the treatment and the control group, for example. So I've had reviewers tell me in their review their reasons for rejecting it. I don't know what blocking means, but your description of your randomization procedures are too complicated, and they're causing me to believe that maybe you didn't actually randomize your sample, right? So they're very sure of themselves in their knowledge of statistics and their opinion on our methods, and they're flat wrong and even admit they don't know what they're talking about, but that doesn't hold them back from recommending to reject our paper for that reason, right? So that's typical. Things actually that's not typical. That's one of the most frustrating ones because I still remember it. But things like that happen a lot, so we have to resubmit. Another problem in my field is the publication pipeline. Even when it does go well, that is often like 2 years or more between when you submit. You've already done the work. It takes a while to write it up and get it into form to submit to a journal. And then you submit it, and it's almost always at least 2 years before it makes it to print. And if you're shocked by that, thank you. You should be shocked, but for some reason that's acceptable in our field. So I have a paper that I just asked a colleague about yesterday that we submitted to a journal back in February, early February. And you can see in the editorial, management system where it's at in the pipeline, and it's still waiting to be assigned to a reviewer. So it hasn't been desk rejected. It made it through that first, but since February, so we're on 6 months plus, it hasn't even been assigned to go out for review, and the reviewers usually have at least 6 weeks, sometimes 8 weeks to review it and turn around, and then usually they'll get bothered for 3 or 4 weeks before they actually do it, and so it'll be a year before they even make a decision, right, about whether they want to just reject it outright or invite us to revise. So it's one would think, in other fields you might think, well, send it to, retract it, send it to a different journal. The problem is they all get away with this. So I have lots of grievances about the publication pipeline, which is one thing that attracts me to open science and just publishing things like preprints or working papers or things like that. There are other things. I got this image from the Center for Open Science website of sort of these things in the red font in the rectangular boxes are sort of this cycle is sort of the basic sort of research cycle, generalizable research cycle for research, and the things in the rectangular boxes are sort of places that are threats to the enterprise, is how I think of it. Sort of threats to science, sort of things that may lead us to have sort of biased views or lead to wrong conclusions. So one is lack of replication. We often trust the one study that's ever been done on that topic, and we might believe that for years and years before anyone has ever sort of replicated that study or looked at it maybe from a slightly different perspective or something like that. That's related to this, on the left, the publication bias. So we all know, whether you're officially taught this or not, but reviewers like to see things with low p-values, right? They like to see things that are, quote, statistically significant, and they're more likely to reject or recommend not publishing something if you don't have low p-values in your statistical study. So as a result, we have this thing called the file drawer problem, where either papers that don't have things with small p-values don't ever get submitted because the researchers know that this is going to be an uphill battle to get it published, or they get rejected through the review process. So there may be, we know there are many studies out there, including some that have done replications, that don't have low p-values, so they've found different results maybe than what reviewers would expect to find, that just never get published. Also, publication bias, because we know that reviewers and editors like small p-values. Researchers then, and researchers are aware of this, whether they're officially taught this or not, they end up analyzing their data lots of different ways until they find that quote, statistically significant result. And then they write it up and share their work often as though those are the only analyses they did. And so this can be called p-hacking, or some people call it phishing. My colleague calls it torturing the data until it confesses, which I think is probably the most apt metaphor for that. But anyhow, so then there's harking. This stands for hypothesizing after results are known, which, again, you notice maybe connections between all of these are sort of bad for the enterprise, right? They can lead us to conclusions that aren't aren't generalizable or maybe are not even correct. And then if you have a lack of replication, then and that study does get published, then we can be misled to believe that that's sort of the defining result there, that nobody goes back and asks, can we reproduce those kinds of findings? So these are all threats to the very enterprise of science, and threats to sort of that can erode public trust if we're sort of believing things that aren't true or aren't replicable or reproducible. So in comes the Open Science Framework and Open Science in general. These are 3 badges that are used. You all are probably familiar with this and may have seen these. They kind of stand for these three of these sort of principles and approaches to try to move beyond some of these threats to the enterprise of science. The badges are also used, I think, learning from things like video games where you can earn these sort of tokens and people are motivated by that. So these badges can the thinking is maybe they'll motivate scholars to want to do these things so they can have this badge. A quote that I love about this, I talk about open science with friends, right? And friends who are researchers, friends who are not researchers. And particularly, the response I almost always get from friends who are not researchers when I talk about sharing data or pre-registering a study or things like that, they're shocked and they say, well, isn't that just how science is done? I love that response because I like that the general public thinks like, yes, that's what we're doing, but it's not, right? We have a long ways to go to reach that level of sort of results being reproducible, data being shared, our publications being accessible to people who want to read them and can benefit from them and need to know those things. But Heidi, I think, said this just very simple thing that I think is really important in open science. It's just good science in a digital era. Now that we can do all these things, share our data, share our code, publish with open access so you don't have to have a print copy that costs a lot of money to print and distribute, we should be doing these things. So what is pre-registration? You all probably know this, but I'll go through the motions here. This is akin to if you play billiards, right? Sort of that when you're playing that game, there's a difference in rigor and quality if you call the shot to get the ball to fall into the pocket versus if you just hit the balls and some happen to by chance fall into the pocket, right? So we know that when we're playing that game and in that setting, or if you're playing horse, right, with basketball, and a lot of times you have to like prove the last one to win the game, right? We know that sort of calling your shot ahead of time is more rigorous than sometimes you can get lucky and a broken clock is correct twice a day kind of a thing. So pre-registration involves documenting your research plan in advance before you do it, and particularly before you have the data and have done your analyses. It can be done. Pre-registration can be done at the moment it's acceptable to do it in fairly general terms or in exquisite detail. That seems to be kind of open to the individuals who are trying to get on board with this idea. Pre-registration is happening across the natural sciences and more so in the social sciences, but I think the social sciences, which is where I'm working, is behind the natural sciences, but hopefully catching up. Why is this important? I think one of the reasons why some of the folks I know in the social sciences are doing it is it increases the methodological rigor, right? So it may protect against things like harking, p-hacking, and to some extent it may protect against publication bias, but I'm not sure. That may be an empirical question. So when can you do pre-registration? You can do it before you collect. If you're planning to do primary data collection, you can do it before you've gathered any data. Or if you're going to do primary or secondary data analysis, you can do it before you've analyzed data that already exists. You also, another important place where you can do it is, sometimes reviewers ask you to do things and they have a position of power when you've sort of been waiting for all this time and for the review, and you get the feedback and they kind of hold the gate to you sharing your study, the results of it, with the world. And sometimes they often ask you to do different analyses than you did and you described. So how does this affect pre-registration? If you agree that those are valid and worthwhile to do, then you can go back and revise your pre-registration, and the rationale being the reviewer or the editor said I should do these other analyses. I think they're a reasonable request and I'm going to go ahead and do them, but I want to preserve my pre-registration by not doing sort of post-hoc analyses that I didn't put in my pre-registration. And so you can also update your pre-registration at that time. Some registries, a very general one is Open Science Framework. And another one in my world is the REES. It's actually hosted at ICPSR, where the previous speaker was talking about. Stands for the Registry of Educational Effectiveness Studies. The general recommendation, sort of following FAIR principles and so forth, are to pre-register your study in a registry that's as specific to the domain in which you're working as possible. Right? So in biology, for example, there are many, many different registries or places where you can share data and so on. In education, there aren't as many. Right? We're still catching up on this idea. Another type of pre-registration in my view that I actually like better, I think is a great idea, is this idea of a registered report. Can I see just a show of hands how many of you all are familiar with this? So, okay, about half the room. So this is, in my view, a different format of a type of pre-registration. The idea is, if these errors are shown, and the graphic I got again from Center for Open Science website, but if this is sort of the flow or the pipeline of publication in a refereed journal, you can write up your plan for your research. So kind of the first half of a paper you might do, sort of what's motivating your study, why is it important to do, what are your procedures and methods you're planning to use, including your data analysis and so on. And then you can stop there and submit that for peer review to some journals. So not all journals have this, but some do, and in my area of education, it tends to be some of the higher quality journals are getting on board with this first. But more seem to be getting on board every time I look. But you submit that, and that's called a stage 1 peer review, and the editors can send that out for review. You can get feedback from reviewers. I think this is a wonderful thing to do. For those of us old heads, we might not sort of like this, but I think our doc students do, because this is basically how a dissertation works in my field. You sort of write up your research prospectus, you submit that to your committee, they review it, give you feedback, you defend it, and you often revise it, and then they sign off and say, yeah, that's a good plan, that's a worthwhile thing to do. And so that's kind of that stage 1 peer review, and it works the same way at the journal. And then if the editor accepts it at that point, it's called a in-principle acceptance. And what that is basically an agreement between yourself and the journal that if you carry out the plan for the research study that you designed in the way that you said you would do it, the journal is committing ahead of time, before you have the results, to publishing the full paper with your results in there. So this is a way, for example, to guard against the sort of p-hacking, publication bias, and so on. So it's a way, among many other things, to help make sure that we're publishing results that we're also publishing results that don't have low p-values and maybe don't have results that are consistent with what we already believe to be true. And it also, a huge benefit of it for you as a researcher is you get free advice from experts in your field before you've done your study. So that can help shape your study, that can help improve your research plan, and it may actually, it may actually sort of help you to not go down a certain pathway that might have been a real flaw in your design. Right? So there's lots of good reasons to do that. And then if you do your study, you can write up the, what you did and your results and findings and implications and all that kind of good stuff and get a publication out of it. I think this is a great model, and I think we should probably all be doing this more. What you also can do, I've talked about this I think already, you also can pre-register if you want to kind of do both. You can pre-register the stage 1 plan, right? Because you haven't collected your data yet, you haven't done your data analysis. So you can still pre-register it at that point. And actually, if you're going to go the route of a registered report, I would recommend waiting, if you can, on the pre-registration until you've made it through that peer review process. Otherwise, you'll likely be revising your pre-registration. So some of the journals in my field that use this system of registered reports are AERA Open, Assessment, Journal of Educational Psychology, and so forth. Educational Researcher, I just learned this week after reviewing for them that they're also doing this also. You can find a list at the web addresses below. Open data. Another important aspect of open science. Sort of why do we, by open data, I'm mostly thinking in terms of sharing the data that you've produced or that you've used in your research. I think one of the important reasons is to amplify the potential impact and legacy of the work that you're doing. There may be methods that exist or that are available 20 years from now that aren't available right now. That can't, and if you don't share your data and make it available to others, including yourself 20 years from now, it may just disappear, and all that investment of time and other resources, expertise, just sort of disappears. So that's an important reason to do that, I think. Probably the worst reason to do it, but still a good reason, is if you're getting funding from the federal government, they're requiring it now. So that's also then a perfectly valid reason to share your data. And some private funding agencies are also doing this. Another really important reason to share your data is not everyone, if you get a $1 million grant to do some primary data collection and to run a study, not everyone in the world has that opportunity. So you can sort of create opportunities for junior scholars or for others who grant writing maybe isn't their particular talent. Maybe they're really good at data analysis and asking good questions of data. So it opens the gate to doing research, to getting publications, and so on. And that's a really important reason. We are really fortunate here in the U.S. also to have a lot of funding for research, but that's not true everywhere in the world. And even for self-serving reasons, if the data are, in my case, they're U.S.-based educational data, So if others outside the US are analyzing data, making discoveries from the data, and then making those discoveries available, that's also helping us here, right, to learn more about our education system and so on. So it's good for everybody. At the same time, I have encountered a general sense that there seems to be, and this seems to be almost nearly ubiquitous belief, that secondary data analysis is somehow lower status than doing the primary data data collection and analysis. I don't know where this idea comes from. I think it's the wrong way of thinking. I know a lot of the very top scholars in my field do this regularly, so secondary data analysis of existing data, but this seems to be a very pervasive way of thinking. And in fact, we kind of need people doing data analysis. So my wife works in the environmental science field, and she has talked with me a lot about, you can't just like put your cardboard and so on out for recycling without closing the loop by purchasing and using things that were made from those things that were recycled, right? I think secondary data analysis and publication from that is similar in that way of sort of closing the loop, and let's keep getting more information out of these data and so on, because there's I don't know about you all, but for me, there's so many important questions to ask of my data that I will never get to in my lifetime, right? And why not put it out there for somebody else to do that and give them the opportunity to have the experience, to get the publications, and for us all to learn from it. So those are some of my answers to why bother sharing data. So talking about sharing data, what concerns do you have about sharing data? You all are fairly enlightened, I believe, on this. But I'll just sort of jump right into some. There are a lot of really valid and important concerns about data sharing. So if you're working in medical research, educational research, there are laws that we must comply with. And so sharing data in ways that would sort of contain personally identifiable information is a no-no, right? Like absolutely can't do that. Or if your IRB says you can't do it, or if you didn't think to tell your IRB when you were planning your study that you were going to share the data, you need to make sure that you're complying with sort of those ethical and legal obligations. A really big one also is, what if there are errors in my data, right? This is a very natural and important question to ask. You should be asking this question anyway, whether you're going to share it or not. But sharing it definitely ramps up I can be found out for making mistakes. It creates a way for the public to do. That's not a good reason to not share your data. It's a good reason to have better data management practices. What I've found in my lab is once we made it clear that our plan is to share the data, everybody tightened up and got better at working with data and got more serious about making sure it was correct. So if you're leading a team doing research, sharing data can actually make you have better quality data. That's what I think have found to be true. Including better quality code, right? Anyone who's writing code probably has really bad habits of not really explaining or documenting, or you have your own little quirks and things. You can get it to work, but another person looking at it will have a really difficult time understanding what they're looking at. So yet another reason where it's helping. Getting scooped is a really important, valid concern in sharing your data. There are ways that you can share your data. You can wait to share your data until you've had a chance to run your studies that you're planning with it. And there's lots of methods for that. All that additional work of documenting it, again, creating a data dictionary, that should be absolutely a really well, carefully reviewed data dictionary should be, non-negotiable all the time, even if you're not sharing your data. But if you are, that data dictionary, it helps you all be motivated to do a really good job of that, right? So it kind of, and then intellectual property is also a really important concern. If you're going to be sharing data, this is yet another thing you need to learn about. For example, you need to learn about Creative Commons licensing and other sort of intellectual property law and systems that are out there. And you should be sharing your data in a way where you're very aware of sort of what kind of licensing and things that you are sharing that through, right? So one tool, I learned this from Crystal Lewis, who has really helped guide my team in the right direction when it comes to data management. Since learning about this, I've talked about this with friends. I have a good friend who got his degree from here at FSU in engineering, and he's the chief of cybersecurity for a data company, a global data company. And I mentioned swim lane diagrams, and he said, "Oh yeah, I thought this is brilliant. My team loves it." And he said, "Oh yeah, he knows about this, and this is standard. My brother-in-law is in the business world, works in logistics, and he knows all about this. I don't know why it took so long for me to learn about it." If you're not aware of it, the idea is this is kind of a visual graphic showing kind of the workflow that a team may use for data management. Seems to be very well known in the business world, and it's something that I just love. So it can kind of track the flow of each lane in this. If you think of this as a swimming pool with lanes, each lane corresponds to an individual or a team. But in my case, I liked it to be in individuals. And it shows kind of where they fit in this overall process of sort of what's their role, sort of what's their lane that they're responsible for doing and that maybe somebody else doesn't need to worry about doing, because they will be expected to do their job. What I've also found on my team is every individual often works and sort of sees their part of it as sort of so important, and they can let it drag on forever and so on. And it really helps us all see how we're all interdependent on each other as we go through here, and that we all fit into this big picture somewhere. I think this does better than like a linear, sort of workflow diagram. Even if it's labeled with names, I think this really helps everybody to see how it works. So swim lane diagrams, get to know them if you're working on a team. Another thing that's, again, just fundamental is a data dictionary. This is the term in my lab we use for it. Some folks call it a code book. In this case, I'm just thinking of it like literally as a dictionary, where it's this rectangular file where I've got the name of a variable and then a description of it so somebody else can know what that variable represents. You can put other information like the values in your data set within that variable. In this one, this is something we use. We make a data dictionary before we've de-identified the data. So for internal use only, this is our data dictionary. And so we put a column as we're working with it, does this contain personally identifiable information that we're going to need to scrub before we make the data available to the public? And that's a tricky one, right? If somebody takes a survey on their computer, there's probably metadata associated with their responses, like their IP address and the time that they took it. And if their boss knows what computer they were on and when they did this survey, right, that could be a way to, for somebody who really wanted to find out something about their responses, could go back and track them down. So de-identifying data is another skill all unto itself. But I would say I've used, in fact, I'm guilty even of sharing data publicly where I've done a not very good job of creating something like this. And so this is just, you know, it's unacceptable to not do this well, but we're all on a trajectory of trying to get better and learning to do better. So, FAIR principles, you all, again, are probably all aware of this, but I'm probably actually going to just skip this so that I can stay on time here. So some data repositories, there are many, many out there nowadays. They range from, you know, domain general like Open Science Framework to ICPSR, which is sort of a little bit less domain general, more in the sort of behavioral and social sciences. And then there are very specific ones. LDBase is a great one that we can be proud of here at FSU. And there are other repositories, not just for data, but also for code and so forth. Open materials, there are open educational resources that I think fall under this umbrella. I think of this often in my work as measures. So whatever it is I use to measure something, can I share that? And I try to do that the best I can for sort of full disclosure, enables other researchers or consumers of our research to sort of scrutinize exactly what we did and how we did it, to decide whether they agree that what, you know, this thing we're calling it, you know, the way we measured it, do they agree that it's fair to call it that thing, for example? Open measures also allows other researchers to use those measures, which helps sort of with integrative data analysis, or, you know, you don't even need to have advanced techniques for doing that. If you're using the same measure, you can maybe compare them directly. That can help improve how we're doing science. So I've developed a lot of measures in my lab, measures of teacher knowledge, teacher beliefs, teacher math anxiety, instructional practice, student thinking and abilities in math, student attitudes and math anxiety. And to the extent that we can, I try to share those. It took a tremendous amount of resources to create them and refine them and get them to a place where they pass muster. And now that we've used them, I want to make them available for others to use them. And others are using them, and I get a lot of joy out of that, to know that sort of it's not just a dead end, and that's the end of that work, is that others are finding them to be useful. We're sharing code. We're sort of making up a system as we go, to try to create a model of sharing data and code and sort of, you know, our initial findings from things. We're sharing through Open Science Framework primarily. And Gizem is there at the back of the room. She very kindly introduced me to this. She's been instrumental in doing this. If I had more time, I'd have you give a quick tour. But we're sharing sort of organizational sort of table of contents, if you will, in there. The data themselves, data dictionary, the code that we use to analyze the data, some of our output files, summaries, sort of things that explain what we did, why we did it, and what we found, so on. For each measure and each wave of data collection that we have, we're doing this. If we knew how to use Quarto or R Markdown better, we would be doing that, but we don't yet. So this is our stepping stone. This is our very work-intensive way of doing what I'm hoping by a year from now, Quarto will do kind of lickety-split for us. But for now, this is how we're doing it. I mentioned intellectual property. It's important to know about Creative Commons, for example, if you're sharing things, data in particular, but also code and things like that. I'll skip over this one. Open access publication is a really important aspect of this. There's a lot of ways to publish things with open access, like preprints and postprints. Working papers, research reports. Digital is so wonderful. We use it extensively in my lab. And I'll tell you, well, I'll get to it in just a moment. But there are journals that I think are I think, fall into this category of sort of hybrid journals where some have a paywall where you have to have a subscription and so forth to access things. But as the author, you can also pay a fee a lot of times to have what they call gold open access so that others around the world can access your work without having to go through a paywall. I think that's nice. It's not really fair, because if you don't have funding to pay that, then you can't publish with open access, but I think it's at least a step. There's something that publishers call green open access that I put a question mark on there. I do not think of this, I do not agree that this is open access. This is basically a publisher, a for-profit publisher usually, calling it open access so that it has that label, so that it be considered to meet some of these federal requirements and so on for open access. But it's not really, because you still kind of have to know the person. It's basically, you can give a copy of your paper to your friends, right? But even if you as the author if your institution or you personally don't have a subscription to that journal, you still can't even go in and get a copy of your own work unless you somehow can get behind the paywall, right? So it's not really open access. But all it is the journal agrees that they're not going to go after you if you share a copy with someone you know. But that doesn't really make it findable by somebody on the other side of the world who is interested in reading your research and could benefit from it. That's my personal belief on green open access. I think it's not really open access. So here are the cover pages of a couple of reports that we in my lab have published through Digital. The middle one, just got the news yesterday. It's finally, looks like it's going to get published. It's been a few years now. Very happy about that. We still have a couple of hurdles in the review process to get over, but the one on the right, we had these results in 2018. We thought they were really important. This is a randomized controlled trial of a teacher professional development program focused on grades 3, 4, and 5 teachers. And we found that the program had a positive, statistically significant, and probably practically meaningful effect on student understanding of fractions, right, at this grade level. This is a big deal. Fractions are a really difficult, sort of challenging topic for teaching and learning, and really difficult interventions often sort of try to improve the way fractions are taught and learned and fail at that. And this is one that we found. Look at this. With a randomized controlled trial of this program, we found that we can move the needle on student understanding of fractions. So we quickly wrote up some of our, sort of sketched out what we did and some of our findings, put it in here. That paper is also still in the review pipeline. This one, I submitted a proposal to the U.S. Department of Education to a program that requires a certain level of evidence for programs to be eligible for funding. And it gets reviewed by an organization called the What Works Clearinghouse, the sort of level of evidence. And because this paper was out there, that grant proposal, this is what put it over the edge for having at least moderate evidence of effectiveness, and made us eligible. And within a year of publication, we got almost $10 million grant award from the U.S. Department of Education. And the fact that we could publish this quickly through Digital is exactly what made our proposal eligible for funding. Very clear line there on sort of how that worked out. And like I said, I mentioned when I started complaining about the long publication pipeline in my field, the resulting paper, which is so much more involved and more elaborate and has so much more detail and other analyses like a cost analysis and cost effectiveness analysis, is still not published, right? 5 years later. So the world had a chance to learn about this, had a chance to immediately impact some things that were done in Florida in the world of math education, benefit literally thousands of teachers and 100,000 plus students because we were able to publish it quickly. So that's a personal story I have of sort of how it'll be great when this is finally published in a peer-reviewed journal, and then we can sort of have that, feather in our cap, if you will. But in the meantime, it already had a really immediate impact, the fact that we published it with open access right away through our institutional repository. So I'm going to skip some of these. I want to not go any longer, but just in summary, open science, I think, is just good science in the digital era. I love that line. And reproducibility should not become a thing we're all striving for, but a minimum standard in science. So, when you're reading a paper, in the old ways, every word was counted in publication because that paper is expensive and there's only so much space and it costs them a lot of money to distribute it. We don't really have that problem right now in the modern world. So we might as well share all the detail of what we did in our analyses and so forth. I don't know any paper published in a journal that you could definitely, confidently take the data, even if you had all the data, confidently analyze it in exactly the way they describe in the journal article, right? There's just not enough room to share all that information. But if you share your code and you document it well, and you share your data, it can be reproduced. And then others can make some different decisions than you did if they think there's other things to be done and other things to be learned, and then they can get another paper out of it. So there's just so many benefits to doing things like that. So I think I'll stop. But right after this next two slides, the easy ways to get involved. Publish your preprints, your working papers, your postprints, or whatever in an archive or in your institutional repository. For us, Digital is fantastic for that. That's easy to do. If you're publishing a journal article, you've already created it. You might as well just share it through the repository or an archive or something. When you're deciding which journals to submit your papers to, select ones that are dedicated open access or at least have a gold open access option. Remember if IRB is a thing that you have to be concerned with in your research, remember when you're writing your IRB application that you are to sort of declare that you're planning to share your data at some point, and have a good plan for doing that in a legal and ethical way. And then consider using the registered report publication process for future studies. I think it's just fantastic. Can't say enough good things about it. More difficult ways is to do a full pre-registration of your next study, work on improving your data management practices. I know I still have a long way to go on that, but we are making progress. And publish the measures that you use if you possibly can. Publish your replication, your code and output files and so on, not just the stuff that makes it through the filter process and makes it to the final publication. Thank you. Are we doing questions or moving to, or comments? I probably have more questions for you all than you have for me. So.
Hello? Thanks so much for your talk. I thought it was excellent.
Thanks.
So you talked a little bit about your frustrations with the long time to publication in your field, at least with the journals that you publish in. And you also talked about how foreknowledge of data sharing as like an end goal for your, the people, your collaborators, has kind of inspired them to develop more sophisticated data management knowledge and practices. This idea of, I'm going to be sharing this, so maybe I should really make sure that I get it right. I wonder if you have any thoughts about open peer review in the same, if it has the potential to also maybe mitigate some of the time to publication issues, and also maybe some concerns about like the consistent quality of peer reviews that we sometimes get from reviewers, with the same, in the same vein, with the same dynamics of this is going to be publicly available, so I should really, invest my best effort in it.
Can you say what you mean by open peer review?
Well, there's, it can take lots of different forms, so it's a difficult question to answer. But the most, fully realized example I can think of is a journal called like F1000 Research. I think it stands for Faculty of 1000. And in that case, you have essentially like preprints that are posted, and then every single aspect and step of the peer review process is transparent. So there's, a publicly available webpage with the preprint, and then, basically a note and some visual indication that it's been sent out to review to named individuals on a certain date. So like anyone can see that like they have agreed to review it, and if there's any kind of delay in them, completing their review, that's visible too. And then eventually when they do, complete the first round of reviews, the full text of their comments to the authors is publicly available as well. And you can kind of trace, as a reader, you can see exactly what was submitted to the journal, exactly the comments that came back, and all of the different iterations of review that might follow before the final published version.
Yeah, I think it's a really neat idea. In my field, that's not ever how it's been done, right? I think in other fields it has. So I don't have firsthand knowledge or experience with it. I've observed that this is happening. I've heard that this is happening, but I haven't experienced it myself. I think the whole peer review process, I think, is a really, really, can have. I think it's a great innovation. It can have a positive effect on the quality of research that's published. It's also a very imperfect system, right? And it's at the end of the day a social system, right? And a human system. So it's flawed. I think my example of a reviewer who doesn't know anything about the kind of research methods that we're doing and admitted that, and yet had no problem then having an opinion on it and recommending and accusing us of lying, and then recommending rejecting our paper. I think a process like that, that person, I think, would be rightfully publicly shamed, right? So for sort of speaking on a having an opinion on something that you don't know anything about, that's an unethical practice from the reviewer perspective, in my opinion, right? If you're reviewing something and you don't know about a topic, just don't speak to it. Like, actually admit that you don't know, right? I've done that lots of times. Like this aspect of this manuscript, I write that to the editor. I am not an expert on that. I can't speak to it. But this other thing, I think I know something about, and here's what I think about it. I think it can and hopefully does encourage better behavior. I think also there is this whole idea of a blind review where, in my field often some of the journals still have you sort of, remove your name as an author from anywhere in the manuscript and write authors, 2019 or something. If we think this is actually making it difficult for the reviewer to find out who wrote this paper, we're just completely fooling ourselves, right? Especially a high-profile study that's unique and something. So one journal that I have submitted a manuscript to, they their policy is you just write it up, you can cite yourself, no problem, there's no masking or blinding needed to be done. I wrote the editor and asked to confirm, is this really what we should do? And that editor said, we expect our reviewers to be professional, not try to figure out who wrote this paper. So that's a different way of doing it. I do think there are, there's power dynamics, right? This is sort of, the whole peer review process is about power. If the authors, though, are powerful in their field and the reviewer is less powerful and influential, it can potentially, and a reviewer sort of doesn't agree that this is, passes muster or upholds certain standards, maybe that could create a way where there's some kind of retribution or something like that. So I think that's something that is worth thinking about.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for your presentation. There's a lot in there that really resonated, despite the fact that, we're in pretty different fields.
Yeah.
With regards to pre-registration, one thing that struck me was the idea that, rarely at the end of a research project did we really, there was no chance we could have realized that's where we were going to end up.
Yeah.
So if we want to start pre-registering our studies, the level of detail is going to have to be so general, and then we're going to have to go back and revise the original concept so heavily.
Yeah.
We might start off like, we want to look at the tissue extract from a particular organism, right? And then you actually do the data collection and analysis and find some result that's really surprising or that you want to dig more into. So you have to go back and do another round of data analysis. So there needs to be a way in the pre-registration concept to continually revise it, update it as the overall research project develops and matures.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think, this is an innovation that we still have a long ways to go to figure out, how can this be done well. I've done some where it is just literally drop our grant proposal in there, and that was good enough. I've done others where I've been part of with Dr. Colleen Ganley, for example. She really took this to heart and wrote in tremendous detail. It felt like 50 pages single-spaced. Like, what will we do if we encounter, if we start analyzing our data and we find this, this branching pathways of, well, this method of analysis is an option, or if we found this other thing, this other method of analysis. And it's so much work. And I think that's especially true if you're not doing something you've already done before, right? If it's not a replication study where you've already used these methods of measuring things and analyzing the data. So yeah, I totally agree. You can revise your pre-registration. In the REIS, where I have pre-registered a study, they just track versioning of your pre-registration, and you can update it. And so at least the record is there that you had a plan, but then you encountered something, so you changed course ever so slightly and so on. But we have a long ways to work out those details.
Yeah, and sometimes projects kind of will bud off and become other projects, and there needs to be a way to track all of that, which I'm not sure we can do well right now. Yeah,
that's where I really like the registered reports idea. Like, I think that's a great use of the peer review process, and also provides you with some protection as the researcher. That, like, okay, if you've put forth this extra effort up front, that's currently not universally expected, you get some sort of agreement that, like, the payoff will be a little bit quicker review and publication process once you've done it.
Dr. Sean, I have a question on behalf of one of my friends who is watching from Turkey, actually, this YouTube. She is a PhD student in elementary education, and she just started her PhD. She is asking, like, what are some suggestions for early career researchers when it comes to open science, like how they can familiarize? And she also wonders if it's a good idea to register her dissertation.
The last question is easy. Yes, you've effectively done that already with writing up your research prospectus and defending it, if that's the method that they use. I think advice for early career is just that, like find data that have been shared in your area of interest, and do the analysis and make some discoveries and findings from that. That idea of sort of close the loop on that, right? I think would be a great way to start engaging in the real practice of research and getting publications and stuff out of it. Secondary data analysis is where it's at. So much effort goes into primary data collection and so on. If I were, we all make choices in life. If I were to make better choices, I'd probably just become a secondary data analysis expert. I'd have a lot more time for hobbies.
Online. Okay, my name is Daljit, and I did my PhD analytical studies of artwork of an artist, Sohan Kadri, who was an immigrant to North America, but emotionally and also tried to understand more depth of the concept of his studies and analysis of his works. I went back to India where he was born. So now I'm kind of in a loop. I'm in touch with to get it proposal get matured for the publication. So all this process, if I knew, so my theses are online by the university in India, which is Punjabi University, Patiala in Punjab. So my struggle is I was always a North American, but doing it over there, now I'm struggling how to find this kind of resources. But by coming here, it has been a help to understand the concept. I love the swim lanes that we can think as a project for myself rather than now I'm swimming from art side due to pandemic to MSIT side. So all these things I'm trying to put together a picture. So thank you so much for everything that I'm learning today. That's my back.
Thanks. I do want to, that reminded me, I meant to give a shout out to Charity Bunton, who's a doctoral student and colleague of mine. She made that particular swim lane diagram. So anyway. Is that all?
Thank you so much, Dr. Sean, for
Thank
your
you.
presentation.